So as Hilal introduced, my talk is titled Learning with Technology in Early Childhood. And let's see. Okay. So for this talk, I went on Google Images and I put the keywords children and technology, and this was the screen that came up. And if you can see my cursor, so in this search on Google Images, as you can see, when I Googled children and technology, it is children, mostly young children, looking at a screen. And I also want to draw your attention to here, if you can see my cursor. The first keyword, the additional keyword Google suggests is school. So here you can, we can understand how people make an association between children's technology use in education, with education, in learning settings. But today I want to paint a different picture than what we see here, which is this. So today my aim will be giving you an overview of different technologies which are beyond television and tablets. And I will talk about learning not necessarily in a classroom setting, but in a more general sense and in more casual settings, such as our homes. And in the first part of my talk, I will be talking about my PhD research, where I conducted at Koç University, and I will be talking about screens, augmented reality, and social robots. And hopefully, if we have time left, I will be then talking my ongoing research, which is about voice assistants and children's programming skills. Okay, oops. Yeah. So first, let's begin with screens.
You control your cursor. There's no problem with that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for letting me know. Perfect. So when we say screens, we may refer to television, computer, laptops, tablets, or phones. And basically, they all display video, which is fast-moving images. And research not only on video, but also about other two-dimensional sources like picture books suggest that children struggle learning information from 2D sources in general. And usually this is termed as transfer deficit or transfer of learning deficit. And this refers to the struggle of young children. The problem is there is a distance between the encoding and retrieval environments of children. So there is a contextual difference between the encoding setting, which is the screen, and where the child is required to retrieve that information, which is the real world. So basically what we refer by learning here is encoding information in one context and retrieving it later in a different context. So children need to transfer that knowledge, and that's why the struggle is termed as transfer deficit. And to be able to transfer knowledge, children need to develop certain abilities like sensory abilities, auditory and visual abilities, memory, of course, and they also need to be able to create, hold, maintain, and modify their mental representations to overcome this transfer deficit. One particular importance of mental representations is this. So when you see a tree on a tablet, for example, here on the left-hand side, this is not a real tree. This is a representation of a real tree, which you may see in a park, for example. So basically, video is a representation of reality. And to be able to understand that this tree on the tablet refers to this tree, children need to develop the ability of dual representation. So they need to be able to recognize the relationship between the symbolic object and its real world reference. And this takes time. Usually it takes around 1.5 to 2 years to be able to do this dual representation. And of course, as adults or as older siblings, we can help children to make this association. So basically, we can help them understand the relationship between the representation on the screen and the reference in the real world. And research with young children suggests different ways of doing this. We may point at similarities between the tree on the screen and a real tree that they have, for example, right outside of the window. We may use language, of course, to point at these similarities. We may use dialogic questioning methods, and we can help children make connections between what they see on the screen and their daily experiences. And we can, of course, repetition helps. So if children are exposed to video content more, it makes it easier for them to make that association. And perceptual realism, so realistic drawings or realistic photographs also help children to build that association. And I want you to realize that the first 4 suggestions, they need a social interaction. So there needs to be someone, an adult or an older sibling, to help children recognize the relationship between what they see on the screen and what they see what they experience in the real world. And one particular case, one particular screen-based technology that helps or that makes it easier for children to make that association is video chat, which is now something we are fully familiar with. So Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, Blackboard, these are great opportunities. These are a little different, basically, from a regular video that they may watch on YouTube, for example. Because thanks to video chat, children can receive contingent feedback, immediate feedback from whoever they see on the screen. So for example, in this example, this young baby is talking to the grandparents, and the grandparents can give immediate, contingent, synchronous, fast feedback to the child. And it is, of course, adaptive because the grandparents can modify their behavior based on the reactions of the child. And they may also use referential cues. So, for example, the child can follow the gaze of the grandparents. So it's much easier for young children to learn information from video chat, basically. And I will not go into the details, but this is just one study which shows that children can learn new words equally well from someone on a video chat or from someone in person, but they are not that much successful when that person is just sharing a pre-recorded video of herself to the child trying to teach new words. So video chat and live interaction, they lead to pretty much similar outcomes in terms of word learning, at least. And at this point, I will mention briefly about my own study, which is related to this. So children are exposed to new information in fictional content. So they may be exposed to new words, new concepts, new moral lessons. But there is one thing we call reader's dilemma, which asks what is applicable from the narrative to the real world and what is not applicable from the narrative to the real world. So for example, dentists are real, but bears in the real world cannot really be dentists. So the children need to figure out what is applicable and what is not. And I will not give much theoretical background, but let me directly jump into my study, and I will be happy to answer any questions later. So what we did was we tried to figure out how children solve this reader's dilemma on books that they may read on, which are called electronic books. So we had 2 stories which were fully comparable. There was one realistic story and one fantastical story. And we read this story either on print, on tablet, and on the tablet it was either with or without any animations. And in both stories, there was the same event, which was a causal event where this protagonist, this girl, was drinking a fictitious juice and was sneezing as a result. And after reading the story, we showed children a similar juice, which was here in the illustration, and we asked whether our friend who drank this juice sneezed or not. So we were curious if they would generalize this piece of information to the real world, to a real juice. And let me directly give you the results. So first off, children remembered more events from realistic stories compared to fantastical stories. And they also remembered more events after reading a print book compared to a book which was read on the tablet. But the story theme, so whether it was a realistic or fantastical story, it did not affect their learning. It did not affect their generalization of that causal information. And the book format did not either. So they were equally likely to remember the target, equally likely to learn that causal event from a print book or an electronic book. But children were more likely to generalize that causal relationship when they thought that that relationship could happen in the real world. So when they thought that it can happen in the real world, they were more likely to generalize that information to the world around them. And they were also more likely to generalize from an animated ebook, so a tablet book with animations, compared to a book, an ebook without animations. So as you can see, reality plays a role in preschoolers learning from electronic books. And now I will continue talking augmented reality. So what is augmented reality? Augmented reality overlays or superimposes information onto the immediate physical surrounding of the user. This is the shortest description I can give. Let's see. And we published a paper in 2019. You are more than welcome to read it and actually give us feedback. So in this paper, we tackled how augmented reality may facilitate learning from a theoretical perspective. So we argue two reasons how AR may facilitate learning. One of them is which AR may draw children's attention to the learning material and promote reflection on it without fully detaching the child from the real world. So many studies show that children interpret augmented reality as real and magic at the same time, which is pretty cool. And augmented reality successfully merges realistic and non-realistic elements. So when I talk about non-realistic elements, previous psychological research shows that non-realistic, improbable, unexpected, surprising events draw more attention compared to expected events. So AR gives this non-realistic experience, but it does it in a very realistic setting because the child is in the immediate learning environment, which makes it much easier to connect whatever they see on the screen to the prior knowledge that they have. Oops. Okay. And the second way which augmented reality may facilitate learning is it actually converges real and virtual representations in space and time. So it reduces the dissimilarity between the learning and transfer contexts. So when using an augmented reality application, children don't need to constantly hold the representation of the physical world in mind while exploring a virtual world, because the learning and transfer environments are the same. So one example can be an AR application, where the child can go into nature and just use the phone to get information about a tree right in front of her. And when you think about it, this is actually very similar to go on a field trip with your teacher who teaches right on the spot about those trees. So these two situations are pretty similar to each other. And as you can see in both these situations, the learning environments and the transfer environments are the same. And you can compare this to reading about this tree, for example, on Wikipedia at home, where your learning environment is different than your transfer environment. And just to give you an idea, so far research shows that AI may be used to teach different skills to children. And mostly studies focus on literacy. They try to teach the alphabet, new words in first and second language, and story comprehension to improve comprehension of young children. And there are also studies where they try to teach information about animals and how to protect the nature. And finally, there are also some augmented reality applications where they try to teach or improve spatial skills of children, where they try to teach numbers, improve handwriting, and color knowledge, basically. But these are unfortunately not very high quality studies, so I would love to invite psychologists or whoever has good experimental design skills to actually tackle augmented reality and children's learning, because these are not coming from the psychology literature. And, whoops, okay. So let's move on to social robots. Sorry, okay. Sorry, okay. So here on this page, you are seeing very different robots from each other. They look very different from one another, but they are all capable of engaging in a social interaction. That's why they're called social robots. And the one in the middle, which is the Neo robot, we may call it a humanoid robot because, as you can see, it has slightly humanoid features. And here, Caspar has even more humanoid features. But these are all social robots, and different studies use different robots, basically. Okay. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the strengths of robots to show why we can use social robots in education. But I must underline that I'm only suggesting to use robots as a supplementary additional tool and certainly not as a replacement of human-to-human learning. So first off, social robots have vocal, gestural, and facial expressions. They are able to show these expressions, which gives them a social and physical presence. And we know from human-to-human learning research that especially gestures and facial expressions, they help children to learn better, and robots have this capability. The second strength is robots allow for personalized adaptive learning. They have sensors which may detect the motivational and educational needs of the learner, and they can modify their behavior accordingly. So based on that, based on those detections, robots can give explicit and also implicit feedback through their vocal, gestural, and facial expressions. One strength, which is maybe the only one that is different from a human tutor, is that robots can repeat things for an unlimited amount of time. And I mean, the only limit is basically whether the child is bored or not, but the robot would not. So this gives a child to repeat educational content as many times as it is necessary. One really cool strength of social robots is that they can take different roles in the learning of children. For example, they can be a tutor where the robot teaches the child, just like a teacher-student relationship. Or the robot may be a peer, and the child and the robot can learn together from a third party, such as a teacher, just like two friends in a classroom, for example. And also, the robots can be a novice, a learner, so the child may teach the robot. And this is actually pretty cool because, I mean, even as adults, I think we all know that we usually learn better when we are explaining something to someone else. And with robots, children can also experience this really cool way of learning. But I have to say, although these are some really cool strengths of robots, currently there are crucial hardware and software limitations. So not all robots can maximize these opportunities. And I will present two brief cases for why using social robots in education. One of them is coming from the literature of autism spectrum disorder. And many studies show that children with ASD, whenever they interact with social robots, they use more spontaneous speech, which is something many therapists are working on with their patients who have ASD. So interacting with a robot increases spontaneous speech. And robots are also used to teach children with autism about turn taking and about imitating other people, and also controlling their gaze and body direction. So several studies conducted with children with autism shows that they may benefit even more than adults. So robots are used widely with children with autism. An additional case for using robots is actually coming from our research. So L-Tutor was a huge interdisciplinary and international project where we studied whether we can teach children a foreign language by using social robots. I will not go into details. You are more than welcome to read the paper on the right-hand side. The social robots for early language learning. We give a nice overview of if and how and why we can use social robots to teach language to children. But also within the project, just to give you an idea, we developed an English curriculum for Dutch children. We developed six English lessons. And what we found is, so we administered this curriculum. And what we found is children were able to learn English words from the robot, but this was not better than learning from a tablet. So this is what I mean by like having all these strengths does not mean that in their current condition, robots can be the best source of learning. At least currently they are not. But if you read this paper, we also have some experimental design issues. So of course, it's just normal that different studies may come to different conclusions. And now I want to briefly talk about my own study. So in this study, we investigated children's perception of robots. And here's what we did. We gave preschoolers 25 different questions in 5 different domains, which were biology, language, machines, physics, and psychology. And we asked these preschoolers to choose either between a robot and a human, or a robot and a cartoon to answer these questions. So basically, we just asked who knows the answer to this question, the robot or the adult, for example, in this case. And we also conducted an NMC properties interview. So we were curious what kind of properties do children attribute to robots? So do they think that robots are biological beings? Are they psychological beings? Do they have perceptual abilities? Or are they just artifacts, just like a table or a chair? And we were curious how this affects their perception of robots as a source of information. So as a source, as someone to learn from. And directly jumping into conclusions, what we found that children were more likely so children, at least in our sample, they thought that robots would know about machines, and they would also be a good source to learn from about physics. But they did not think that robots would be knowledgeable about biology or psychology. Whereas with language, it was really just in the middle. So this makes you think, because I mean, in the L-Tutor project that I just mentioned, we were trying to teach preschoolers a new language. But this study shows that maybe children are just not thinking that robots are capable of teaching them language. Of course, this is not conclusive, but it just makes the suggestion. And an additional finding was that the more animate properties children attributed to robots, they were more likely to think that a robot can be a better source of information compared to a human, an adult. So this was especially the case for perceptual abilities. So when children thought that a robot can see and feel, then that robot may be a good source of information in general compared to a human adult. So just to summarize the study, in our sample, children perceived robots as knowledgeable about machines and physics, but not about biology and psychology. And they preferred the robots over the cartoon character in general, but they always preferred the human adult over any other source, which makes sense if you think about it. And children were also more likely to choose the robots over the human adults when they attributed more animate characteristics to robots, especially, as I said, the perceptual ability. So I talked about 3 different tools, 3 different technologies, and 3 different studies, and even actually more than 3 studies. So what all this, I think, comes to is that young children can and they are willing to learn from different digital sources, as long as they are grounded on reality, as long as they can make a relationship between that piece of information, whichever technology you are using to communicate that information, but it needs to be grounded on reality. So whenever children can make a connection between the piece of information and the real world, then the technology basically does not matter, as long as they can make this connection. And I call this reality check. So they just need to check whether it's related to reality or not. Okay, I will continue by my future research. So the rest of the talk, I unfortunately don't have any data, mainly because I began my postdoc in January, and the second reason is obviously the pandemic going on. So we are collecting data, but very slowly. But I want to introduce 2 other technologies and how they may be used to teach young children new information. So when we say voice assistants, what I mean is, for example, Siri on iPhones, or Google Assistant, Google Home, Alexa, Cortana. These are all virtual assistants which helps you to ask questions to the internet verbally. And I was curious if people in Turkey actually use voice assistants or not. And just last week, I asked people, and it was a very simple survey. 176 people participated. They were all living in Turkey. I mean, I excluded those who live abroad. So this data is based on people who currently live in Turkey in different cities. And as you can see, only 4.5 people have never used a voice assistant at one point in their lives, but the rest has used a voice assistant at least once in their life. So this was much more than what I expected. And as you can see, it's a very, very high number. Of course, this was snowballing sampling that I contacted through my friends, so we cannot really trust the data, but it still gives an idea of how prevalent these devices are, at least among adults. And I think they will be even more prevalent. But why study voice assistants? I think the coolest reason is that now young children who cannot read or write can do internet search. Now they have this vast source of information right in front of them, and they can just verbally ask internet questions. Which is really, really cool if you think about it. And second, previous research shows that there is a learning curve in how to ask more efficient questions to voice assistants. Because if you have ever used one before, sometimes you need to phrase your questions in certain ways. And for children, it takes time to learn how to do that. So this gives us a nice opportunity to see how children learn to ask more efficient questions and how they phrase their questions. Why do they ask certain questions in certain ways? So basically, voice assistants allow us a new perspective or window to study children's question asking behavior in general. And of course, there are also the characteristics of these devices. First of all, they don't have an embodiment per se, at least not like a social robot, for example, because you just saw that, like, for example, the Neo robot has arms, legs, but a phone or an Alexa, a Google Nest is quite different than that. But they have a human voice. So when you're interacting with a voice assistant, it's as if you are interacting with a human who is trapped in that device. And another cool feature I would say is voice assistants are very much prone to misunderstandings. And this is actually, I will come to this in the next slide, but this is actually, again, a very nice way to study children's phrasing of questions. So these are some theoretical reasons why using voice assistants to study children's learning, but I also have another business-related reason. So this is a new, so Mattel, the company which created the Barbie and Uno and like this huge company, this huge toy company, they actually developed a voice assistant a few years back, which was specifically designed for babies. So they thought this could be a babysitter for babies, and it would like sing lullabies, as it says here, or like it would teach them the alphabet. But obviously there were some huge privacy issues, and they had to retract this this idea. But the product was ready, and it's only a matter of time if we will have these voice assistant babysitters in the future, if and when they can solve these privacy issues. So they will become more prevalent over time. At least that's a possibility. And at this point, I can make a little bit of an advertisement. So what we are currently doing is we are collecting voice recordings from parents. We are basically just asking parents to make a recording of their child talking to any voice assistant and just send it to us. And if you're interested, just leave me a message later of this talk, and I will be happy to share this advertisement with you and the link to the online study. But what I want to talk about is what we want to do with that data. So first of all, once we will get these voice recordings of children's conversations with voice assistants, we want to understand, we want to code this data to answer these questions. One of them is, what do children think about these devices? What assumptions do they make? Do they think Alexa is smart? Do they think Siri is capable of emotions, for example? And we are also curious what kinds of questions they ask. Do they ask why questions? Do they ask what questions? And why do they ask the questions that they ask? And we are curious how children phrase their questions. So what kind of verbal markers, for example, they are using. And we're also curious how they follow up on their questions. So when they receive an answer from Siri, for example, how do they build upon that answer, or if they do follow up on those answers that they receive? And I'm personally very much interested in how do they deal with the misunderstandings of these devices, because as I said, I mean, you may ask Alexa, I don't know, how to go to school, and it may understand something completely different. We are curious how children deal with these misunderstandings. Do they rephrase their questions? If they do rephrase, how do they rephrase? And finally, we are interested in the effect of embodiment. Because as I said, these are quite different than social robots or humans. They are more similar to tablets, but we are curious if this has an effect on their question asking behavior and learning as a result of that. And finally, something seemingly irrelevant, but in my mind they're all connected. I also want to talk about very briefly about an ongoing project. So this project we unfortunately had to stop in March because of the pandemic. But I still want to give you a brief idea of what we have been doing and what we will hopefully be doing in the near future. Oops. Okay, so I don't know you, but I've been seeing over the past years, maybe 5 years, I've been seeing a lot of advertisements of programming courses for children. And even some parents of our child participants, like after they participate to our studies, they would ask, oh, like which programming course do you think I should send my child, etc. So programming is a huge issue. It's obviously a great skill to have in adulthood, but many researchers were also interested in whether it is worth teaching children about programming when they are 3-year-olds, for example. And when we're talking about learning how to code, you may code for a virtual environment, just like on the left-hand side. So you may code a computer game, for example. Or you may code for a physical environment, where in this case, these children are coding a robot. So you may have these different environments. And one meta-analysis, which was conducted with 105 studies with different age groups of children, they found moderate effects of programming on cognitive skills. What they found is, apparently, based on these 105 studies, learning how to program may improve creative thinking, math skills, metacognitive skills, spatial skills, and reasoning abilities. But at least based on their analyses, it looks like learning how to program may not have an effect on school achievement of children or their literacy abilities. So this was one of the first meta-analyses looking at this, but we were curious, when do these cognitive benefits occur? So what we did is we built a 7-week, we designed a 7-week intervention study for 3rd and 4th graders, where we were teaching children how to program a robot in different ways. So we had different conditions, and we were basically comparing methods of teaching of how to program to these young children. And we had some pre and post tests. We were measuring children's metacognitive abilities, creativity, nonverbal reasoning, etc. But we also measured their STEM attitudes. So if this intervention would change their attitudes towards science and engineering, for example. But as I said, like, we conducted the pretest, we administered 3 weeks of classes, but then we had to stop. But hopefully we will continue this project, and hopefully in our next maybe talk, I can be able to give you an idea of if and when teaching children how to program may have an effect on their cognitive abilities. So this was just a glimpse of what I have been doing. So to summarize, okay, so this was, I think, one of the strangest talks that I've ever given, because I mentioned all these really different tools from each other. And I mean, in my mind, they're all connected. My only question is, we can use technology to teach children new information. But of course, they're also very different from each other. I mean, these are all very different tools. And I mean, I can talk about each of these devices for 5 hours each. And I can say that currently in the literature, there is too much focus on the devices. What we need to remember is hardwares and softwares change, technology advances, but what's important is to try answering fundamental questions about cognitive development and children's learning. That's what I'm trying to do. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I think it's just some devices are so cool that you just want to learn about that specific device. But I always try to remind myself to ask these fundamental questions about children's learning from technology, whatever that source is. And another thing to keep in mind is actually ethics of all this. Mattel was not wrong in retracting their voice assistant babysitter. I mean, even in our study, when we are collecting all these conversations of children with voice assistants, obviously we also have privacy concerns. So we all, like, whenever we are working with technology, we also need to remind ourselves and our participants to keep this in mind, basically. And this was the end of my talk. Thank you very, very much. And I will be happy to answer your questions.
Yes, thanks, Cansu, a lot. So there was a lot of information. So I learned a lot.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah. So first of all, our guests, participants in the seminar, is there any question about this talk or any other issue related to learning from technological devices in childhood? First, you. I think Senay has a question.
Can you hear me, Hilal?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you to Dr. Cansu for being with us. It was really cool research that you talked about.
Thank you.
So my question is going to be about something very basic, very fundamental, perhaps, to all of your research. And let me know if you want to answer this later on and take other questions first.
Sure.
So you talked about different kinds of devices and how they affect children's learning. And you talked a lot about teaching and learning in general using these devices. So, and you compared them to learning from humans. When we talk about learning and teaching, of course, there is the venue of representation, the kind of representation that the tool is using, but also there's added interaction to it, and different tools can give different levels of interaction. And I think that complicates things. That's why I don't want to go into the teaching and learning part of it yet. My question is going to be, I want to compare books, like print books, and screens. So we write or draw pictures on a paper. Writing is signs on the paper. And we read it, we understand it, and we think with it. It becomes a tool for our thinking. Let's assume that we are working with children who are literate, who can read. Or we can talk about adults. So I want to understand if this signs on paper are at the same level of representation, theoretically, with writings or images or signs on a screen. They should be, shouldn't they? But you did mention that there are some differences in outcomes for children when they read from printed books versus screen. And also recently, I've heard about this really cool research. They looked at a university students taking notes during a lecture, and when they were handwriting their notes, they retained more information versus when they were taking notes on a laptop. I mean, this doesn't make sense to me. And I just want to understand this at the very basic level. Is there a difference in terms of representing stuff on writing on a paper and on a screen?
So my answer would be this. In terms of representation, there is actually, as long as they are identical, there is a text that you see on the screen, and then there is a text that you see on paper. At the level of representation, as you said, there shouldn't be any difference. The difference comes from how we interact with those representations. So reading and writing are also different. So first I will mention about the last study that you mentioned. I'm also familiar with the study where adults are taking notes either on a computer or by writing by hand. And when you are writing by hand, your hand is making different movements when you write the letter A versus where you write the letter B. Whereas when you're typing, there is really not much difference. It's just doing this or like this, however you type. So this is what I mean by having the representation is the same theoretically, but how we interact is different. So in writing, I think the difference is quite like easy to see, let's say. But when it comes to reading, as you said, again, it shouldn't really make a difference if they are the same representation. But usually reading, I don't know, actually about reading, it's still different, I would say. First of all, we have different tools on reading on a device. For example, we can have hyperlinks where we can click and then select. Just think of yourself on Wikipedia. You are searching one thing on Wikipedia and then you end up on a completely different page like half an hour later, and you've already forgot what you have been searching in the past half an hour. Whereas on print, it's really a linear experience. You are really just turning the pages one by one. So again, this is a difference in terms of interaction, I would say. Does this answer your question?
Sort of. Can I ask a follow-up question? Do I have time?
For me, it's perfectly fine. Hilal can moderate the Q&A. I don't know how she prefers. Hilal, should we continue? Hilal is, okay. Go on. I'm listening.
Go on. Sorry, Kiraye interrupted. Sorry. So just.
Of course, no problem.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Hilal?
Yeah, I will also comment on this. So please go, Senay.
Okay. So when I'm taking notes by writing on my notebook, I don't only write letters, but I also draw lines between different kinds of notes. I sometimes make small drawings. I put a star, and it's really easy to use the paper to organize my thoughts in a way that I interpret while I'm listening to the lecture. And I think, I don't know the details of that study, but if taking notes on a paper would be superior, it's going to be because of that, not because I'm writing the letter A with a pencil versus I'm typing the letter A on a screen board.
I see. Experimentally, it would, I mean, I agree. First of all, I agree. I'm a pencil and pen person, that's for sure. But experimentally, if you want to compare, of course, you need to build your experiment in layers, right? So, of course, what I mentioned would be the first layer, just like keeping everything constant, but only changing the medium. Upon that, as you said, there are other advantages of using a pen and paper, of course. I mean, ideally, we can do the same on a PDF reader, for example. We can also use, I mean, on my laptop, I have this pen, which is it's a touchscreen laptop. I'm never using this. I bought this thinking I would use this, but I'm not. So the thing is, at this point, I will again go back to children. Of course, it's a term we can discuss, this digital native thing. I personally learned how to write on paper, and children still do learn how to write on paper. But for me, basically, writing on a tablet, either using this pen or the keyboard, came later. I mean, I'm young enough, but it came later. I'm just wondering if in the future, first grader children will learn how to type on a touchscreen device. Then it would be really cool to see what you said. Then it would be really nice to study if those children also benefit more from writing and drawing and underlining with a pencil.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to comment on this maybe, but it's a combination of comment and question, by the way, John. So when it comes to measuring performance on something like learning, because in general the dependent variable is like learning, right? To what extent, how much the child learned from that device. So it's all bring the issue of memory. So you actually mentioned about this in the augmented reality issue, because there's a match between the encoding and retrieval settings. So context dependent memory, by the way, we are basically referring to the famous study in 1975 where Godwin and Baddeley did this research with scuba divers. I don't know if you remember that study, but people remembered more words when they are tested, when there was a match between their learning and testing environment. So whether it's, I'm not sure if it is the level of representation, but maybe it's just the level of match between the environment. So where you are learning the material and where you are being tested or being asked the question about the learned material. So when there's a match, you are doing it great. So maybe this is one of the problems why students also cannot performing well when they're taking notes on the computer, because when you're writing down, you are also encoding the cues in the environment. And most of the students are being tested in the, again, class environment. So you are also remembering those cues that you are encoded during that time is also enabling or facilitating your memory, your retrieval process. Probably this is one of the issues that is playing all behind. And I just wonder whether in child studies, researchers are taking account the memory skills of children, like to what extent?
They do. At least I'm most familiar, in that sense, I'm most familiar with ebook, electronic book studies. And usually in those studies, people are looking if, just as I did. So if they can remember events from a story, and in cases, they usually take a measurement before the study of children's memory in general.
In general, okay.
Yeah, I mean, regarding your first point about the context, it's also very important for researchers to make conscious decisions on how to define learning, right? I mean, because you can just think about like recalling or recognizing, or you may, just as we did it, you may define it as generalization. So across contexts, this also either strengthens your study or just makes it poorer. So it also depends what are we really thinking about when we say learning.
Beyza has a question, but before that, we have a written question. Beyza, sorry, we have a written question first.
Okay, no problem.
So Boran's question is, when we talk about robots, we see that they are partially successful in teaching knowledge, but I think the concept of experience is an important thing for children during the learning phase. In addition, it's only important for children to see the mistakes made while learning something. But robots mostly don't make mistakes. What effects can this have on children's learning? So we would love to hear your opinions on the subject.
First of all, thank you very much for the question. Let me tackle it in parts. So where you say robots mostly don't mistakes, they actually can. You can program them to be very dumb or very smart, of course. So when I talked about the different roles that robots may take, I also said that they may pretend to be a learner. So the child may teach, so a teacher may teach the child, and then the child may teach that information to the robot. And in those cases, usually researchers program those robots, the learner, the student robots, to make mistakes. Because the more mistakes the robots make, the child has the opportunity to repair those mistakes and explain why they are mistakes. So you can actually, that's the beauty of robots, I would say. They are very adaptive. You can program them to do anything that you want. Yeah, so this actually, I guess this answers your question, I hope. You can, of course, ask a follow-up question, but the whole experience, again, the beauty of robots is you can, of course, it's not a human-to-human interaction, but you can create a naturalistic interaction as much as possible between a robot and a child. But then, of course, the ideal is not to mimic the relationship between human to human. Robots can other strengths, and you can just use those strengths to teach information to children.
Now, Beyza, it's your turn. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, thank you, Cansu, for your wonderful talk, and also thank you, Boran, for your question, because it's very related to my area. So, Cansu, you have talked about natural, expected interaction patterns between robots and children, but in natural interactions, we know that there are lots of communicatively ambiguous situations, or there are some like mistakes, some communicative breakdowns in natural interactions between adults and children. So I'm really wondering how children deal with these situations when they are interacting with a social robot or other types of technology. So let me give some examples. There might be different cases. Think about a little young child. So a father can label an entity, like in terms of adjective, we can say that this is orange, portakal rengi, or we can say that turuncu for the same entity. Okay, so there might be two different labels for the same entity in terms of adjective. Or sometimes we can use like contradictory cues in terms of nonverbal and verbal for the same entity. While pointing to something, we can label the other thing. Or sometimes we can give information, over information or under information in an interaction. But usually there's a research showing us, really a lot of research showing us that, okay, children usually prefer to just enough level of information in their interactions with adults. Okay, so what should we expect from robots, or what children really expect from social robots or other types of technology? Okay, so when assume that a robot makes a mistake, okay, this mistake can be one type of it I have already mentioned. So is there any research showing us that how children deal with referentially or communicatively ambiguous situations? And another question is this: you have already mentioned that there are different, depending on the type of information, children's reliance on robots might be different. So there is a huge research showing us that whether the communicator, whether the speaker is knowledgeable or not, is really important for children to rely on that information. So what will happen when a child thinks that the robot is knowledgeable about physical entities, physics, but not really other types of, I didn't remember which type of information you have mentioned.
Machines and physics, they think they're knowledgeable, but biology and psychology, they don't.
So then I expect that depending on the topic, the children's learning from robots might be different. So especially if the interaction, how they really learn from mistakes, from communicative breakdowns, all of them are really interesting questions. Do we have any research showing us that children can deal with these situations?
So not that I can think of, but after this talk, the Q&A, I will definitely check the papers that I have again, because there might be, but I cannot remember. My anecdotal observations between robots and children, they give up. So they basically don't deal with these really uncomfortable situations, and they can get very frustrated. That's another thing. Versus, of course, like between a child and an adult, the child may ask another question, or like try to draw the attention of the adult, or maybe ask a clarification question, like whatever. But in case of robots, children, as I said, like this is just observational, but they just like look at the experimenter, like what the heck is this robot talking about, basically. So that's my observation. And also, as I also said in the talk, at least under the current status quo, I am not, and I will not actually suggest robots to be a substitute for human-to-human interaction, right? You also mentioned, what I think is, of course, human-to-human interactions are very complex, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, an adult's ambiguity, as you said, is also a learning opportunity in itself, because then the child needs to clarify whatever the question was, for example. But what I think is robots are very good for targeted information, just like maybe the L-Tutor project that I mentioned. So if you just want to teach children a list of English words, just like nouns, adjectives, verbs, very targeted information, then a robot may be helpful, but just not for complex, spread it out information, I would say.
Okay, so we have designed a research for this using technology, ebook. I think it's really nice for us with a group of students at MEF University. We have designed a research. It is really nice for us just receiving your feedback about if you can collaborate with us, really nice.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
of course. Shoot me an email.
Okay, thank you, Cansu.
Thank you very much for the question.
Cansu, I have a warning for your voice assistant project following this.
Please. Please do.
You will consider whether children repeat or rephrase or try to clarify themselves when they are interacting with voice assistants. So what you observe with the social robots may also this might be something that you may observe when children are interacting with voice assistants as well. Maybe this is your exploratory question, by the way. I don't know the details about your research questions, but this is something that you will probably observe because when they're also when Siri, for example, says something stupid according to chat's point of view, they are trying to, in general, they give up. Probably this is something we'll encounter with.
Certainly, and we are collecting data in Turkey, but also in Germany, Italy, and the United States. And especially in the United States, these voice assistants are more widely used. I mean, not on the phone, but also on the smart speakers. And our pilot data shows, it gives some interesting impressions related to your question. It's actually, so when a child comes to the lab to interact with a social robot, it's 100% of the time the first time that the child sees a robot, which is a very freaky entity to face with. Whereas especially our participants from the United States, they already have Alexa in their home. They already have Google Home. They've already seen their parents try to use the navigation on Siri in the car, for example. So they're actually much more willing to continue the conversation because they already have an idea what that device is. And secondly, another cool thing we are realizing in the data is how parents explain how to use the voice assistant to the child. Because each time you ask a question to Alexa, you need to say, "Hey, Alexa." You cannot really continue without saying, "Hey, Alexa," because it will not pick it up. And it's really cool to see how parents explain how to use, how to phrase their questions in a certain way to their children. So I completely agreed. But so far, it's been easier to, it's just easier to study voice assistants than social robots, I can say, in terms of those interaction.
And do you have any other question? I saw someone raising her hand, but if not, I will go with the humanoid. I can't pronounce.
Humanoid.
Humanoids. Okay. So, is there a way to integrate, cues, other cues like pointing or gesturing. So because these are other channels that we use frequently while we are engaging in real interaction. So maybe this may make a difference about the level of learning from a social robot.
So the literature is full with studies on robots and gesture and language learning. So this, like, you can find a bunch of papers where researchers try to teach children a foreign language, words in a foreign language, by using the robot gestures. And it looks like it works. Okay. The problem is, for example, in the Tutor project, we used Neo Robot, which has 3 fingers, just like this, like a claw, maybe we can say. The problem is all these fingers move together. So there is only one motor that controls. So the robot can't do this. It can only do this, which is obviously a huge problem if you try to teach the word 2 or 1 to the children. So this is what I mean by having hardware problems. I mean, of course, can't a robot make this? Of course they can, but at least the Now robot currently can't. But there are other robots which can. But there are many studies looking at what you suggested. In the Tutor project, in some of the studies, we did not find an effect of robot gestures on children's word learning. But there are many other studies which shows that robot gestures may help children to learn new words. So,
yeah. Okay. Any question from our participants in the seminar? Any comment, question? So you said, Cansu, there are a lot of experimental questions that need to be answered. So maybe in the future you may give a reading and research course in our department, and with our, brilliant students, you may give some answers to those questions, because they are very ambitious.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to do. So it's the best area to collaborate, I would say. Yeah.
I just have a comment for the voice assistant, because you actually know what I'm doing. So peer-to-peer talk. So whether they are using rephrasing or whether they are engaging repetitions when they don't understand what their friend is referring to, maybe you need to also take into account the context or subject which they are talking about as something to code, because it makes difference. Maybe in voice assistant interaction, it could be a potential moderator that may influence the total number of repetitions or total number of rephrasing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mai, do you have a question? I see. Yeah. Okay, go.
I did have one, and since no one else is asking more questions, I thought I'll go ahead. So, Cansu, at the beginning of your presentation, you presented some theoretical work on representations, and I think I missed the very first part. So that's why I'm asking, was that Parnar or Perner's work, or if that there are other people that you would want to recommend to me if I wanted to learn about different levels of representations?
So in terms of video as a representation and children's dual representation abilities, I can suggest Georgine Trosset. I can already send you the names. I'm trying to go back to the slide, but it's so slow. Sorry. Can I just? So Georgine, this is taking. Okay. I will not. Can I just? No. So you can look at her work. There is also let's see. Oh, okay. Whoops. Okay, I think I managed. Yeah, so Georgine Trosset's work is, I think, the most relevant about dual representation. There is also Strauss. I cannot remember her first name. Let me make a note of this so I can send you the names. I think that will be easier. Trosset and Strauss are two names that I can think of, and I will think of more.
Okay, so any other question? Comment? If not, we are coming to an end. Senay, any other, is it a new question because you raised your hand? Or if not, oh, okay, maybe it's just a mistake. Okay, so thanks, Cansu, a lot for being
Thank you for the invitation
and sharing your research. So just engage social interaction while using technological devices.
Exactly. That's the take-home message.
Questions about pandemic, but I just ask them later on because 5 or 6 hours a day using iPad and TV, but no social interaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's of course a whole different, yeah. That's, I think, a different discussion for
Okay.
at least, it requires at least 2 hours.
Thanks a lot. Size de teşekkürler
Thank you.
arkadaşlar. Sanırım bugün yabancı bir katılımcımız olmadı. Görüşürüz. Kendinize iyi bakın.
Çok teşekkür ederim herkese. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere. Görüşürüz.
Evet Cansu, gittin mi? Aslında bu pandemide 6 saat 7 saate kadar, dur şu kaydı durdurayım.